can tell I'm at my home away from home, Lethbridge, Alberta. I've been here a dozen times because I come here for this courthouse. This is the nearest court to the Coutts border protest that happened 2 years ago. All the criminal charges that were laid at the Coutts border protest are being heard in this courthouse here. And as you can tell by the large gathering behind me, today is a big day. It's day one in the trial of the so-called Coutts 3, or as the prosecutor calls them, the leadership group. I think they were the leaders, although it was a very grassroots, organic protest, very populist, very grassroots, very different from the kind of left-wing professional protests that Canada's used to seeing. I find the one key difference between protesters who are freedom-oriented, protesters on the right, is they're more individualistic, of course, but they actually know why they're protesting. If you would have gone to the protest at Coutts, Alberta, or in Ottawa 2 years ago, or at the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit, where there was another protest, and asked anyone there, why are you here? They would have talked your ear off about freedom and the illegitimacy of the various lockdowns and mandates. Contrast that to the kind of rent-a-mob protests you see on any given left-wing issue. And I know this from personal experience. You go to a left-wing protest and say, why are you here? They don't know why they're there. They're honestly there either because they're actually being paid or they're just called up. Come on, we're having another protest today. We'll give you the sign. And they always direct you to an official spokesman. I think it's very different. And as you can see, the group behind me, very severely normal people. These are farmers and business owners and families. And there's actually a lot of kids here today. Everyone here is here because they believe in the freedom fight that they saw expressed in that border protest 2 years ago. You might recall that Rebel News sent lawyers to be embedded with the protest from almost the beginning. We knew that things were going to be difficult because the police were trying all sorts of, in my opinion, unethical tricks. But also, we wanted to make sure that these unsophisticated protesters, let me put it that way, as in it's their first protest, that they didn't fall into any traps, that they weren't provoked, that they weren't, because of course, the protest, it was extremely cold out there, and a lot of the protesters would gather for warmth in the saloon, which is sort of like the bar, I guess, in the Star Wars movie. Any manner of wretched folks were there, including police and undercover police trying to tempt, trick, or trap the men. And indeed, that did happen in the case of the so-called Coutts 4. Today's the trial of the Coutts 3, George Jansen, Marco van Hugenbos, and Alex van Hert. These are the three men who often liaised with the police, who gave advice to the others. At least that's how it looks like on the inside. It'll be interesting to see what position these men's lawyers take in court. Today is jury selection, which is a very exciting and important thing. Most trials in Canada do not have juries. They're judge alone. But by selecting a jury, these men have made the strategic calculation that they think they're more likely to get a sympathetic hearing by 12 of their neighbors than they are by a hand-appointed judge, most likely appointed by a Liberal Prime Minister. But even if it was appointed by a Conservative, judges come from a certain socio-economic strata. They are, by definition, men and women of the establishment. We've seen in other lockdown or pandemic trials that the judges tend to believe, for example, the health industrial complex. They would never be skeptical of a Theresa Tam or another public health officer. By making the deliberate choice to entrust their safety, future, and liberty with their neighbors, they're saying, I trust the common sense of the common people more than I trust the wisdom of an elite judge. I think that's wise. It makes me think, if you'll permit me a tangent, a couple of years ago, when a judge, and Adam Germain was his name, he was a Liberal appointee, when he heard a case involving Arthur Pawlowski and Chris Scott, he said outrageous things like, we all know someone who died from COVID, and anytime you speak contrary to the public health officials, you must read this self-denunciation that what you're saying is wrong. It was a compelled speech ruling. It was overturned 3-0 by the Court of Appeal. But you take my point, you had a 70-year-old Liberal appointee who just wouldn't even accept that the establishment could be wrong, accepted that we all know that this pandemic is devastating and we must obey it. But just the mindset of such a cocooned judge high on Mount Olympus, that's one end of the spectrum. But ordinary men and women in Lethbridge is the other end of the spectrum. And these defendants, in my view, are very wise for choosing that. So jury selection, remembering from my law school days, I've never participated in jury trial, even when I was a lawyer. They sort for certain things. For example, you can't be a lawyer on a jury and think about, well, why wouldn't you want a lawyer on a jury? No, because other jurors would defer to that person too much. And, he's an expert. You wouldn't want someone who is blazingly partisan, who says, I know they're guilty, or I'll never convict. You wouldn't want someone with a hard heart like that. So there are questions that the prosecutors and the defense lawyers will have agreed on to vet jurors. But then, again, going from memory of law school from 30 years ago, you have what's called peremptory objections. You could say, I don't really like the cut of that person's jib, but I can't quite put my finger on it, but I get to play a certain number of these cards. I don't want that person on the jury. So it's a fairly high-stakes business, jury selection. And it's going to be fascinating to see who each side objects to, etc. And once that jury is impaneled, well, then the business gets underway. You might know that I've been coming down here literally for 2 years to this courthouse, but most of what I've been covering over the last 2 years has been blanketed by a publication ban. We've heard fascinating things, troubling things, amazing things in this court, but we couldn't tell you about it. And the reason for that is they didn't want to taint the jury pool. They didn't want someone who's going to be impaneled on that 12-man jury to hear snips and shards and fragments of evidence before they get in that room, because the evidence they might hear might be out of context. It might be hearsay. There might be legal flaws with it. So the idea was any preliminary discussions would be only for the courtroom to know, not for the wider public. But once the jury is impaneled and once the trial gets underway, whatever happens in that courtroom, well, the jurors will see it. And so then we can report on the details. Now, most of the dramatic stuff was in the other trial I mentioned briefly, the Coutts 4, the men who have been in custody these 2 years. But I think this trial, the greatest analogy for the trial that's starting today, is that of Tamara Leach. Namely, Tamara Leach was held out as her and Chris Barber as the leadership team for the protests in Ottawa. Now, again, these protests are organic. They're grassroots. They were not directed by any political party. Attempts to organize them were frustrated by the government. For example, the Ottawa convoy raised $10 million on GoFundMe. GoFundMe rescinded the donations. They raised another $12 million on Give, Send, Go. The government issued freezing orders. My point is, the trucker convoy was as grassroots as it gets. Sure, there were people who naturally emerged as moral leaders and made certain decisions and acted as spokesmen, but this was not a corporation. This was not a well-oiled political machine. These were ordinary Canadians coming together in the crisis in a like-minded thing. And it's going to be interesting to see what they can hang around the neck of these Coutts 3, and if that even amounts to a crime. Because these three men, and I've had the chance to meet them each, and of course, Rebel News is crowdfunding their legal defense along with the Democracy Fund. They're just peaceful protesters. They engaged in some civil disobedience, perhaps, but did they actually commit a crime? And it'll be interesting to see if the prosecutors can make the case that they had. I think that had there not been a political basis for the prosecution here, these three men would have had a half-day trial a year and a half ago, at most a slap on the wrist, what we call a conditional discharge or an absolute discharge, and the judge would say, now don't you do that again. I don't want to see you in court again. Get out of here. Mischief, of course, is the lowest level of crime in the criminal code. It's typically for vandalism or even shoplifting has its own offense, but it is the lowest order of crime on the books. And I think that the reason they've been turning these grand productions with a 12-man jury and years of prosecution is because these are actually political trials. Tamara Leach has been put through a many months long criminal trial for mischief, which I learned from one of her lawyers, Keith Wilson. It is the longest mischief trial, not just in Canadian history, but in the history of the entire Commonwealth, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. There has never been in the recorded history anyone who has been on trial longer for the petty charge of mischief than has Tamara Leach. And why is that? Well, obviously, because they want to make the process the punishment. They want to get her in the process itself, even if they can't convict her. And I wonder if we'll see the same thing here in Alberta. Will this prosecutor, his name is Stephen Johnston, and he is animated by a vendetta, as far as I can tell. He was the same prosecutor who went after Pastor Arthur Pavlovsky. He's the same prosecutor, if I'm not mistaken, that went after Chris Scott at the Whistle Stop Diner in Red Deer. This guy is not a prosecutor in the main. He is a crusader on a political mission to punish the men who dared stand up to the establishment. And it's going to be fascinating to see if 12 men and women on a jury agree. I don't know if you can see, but there's a couple of cops on bicycle patrolling over there. I see police driving around the neighborhood. There's a paddy wagon over there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cops over there. Another half dozen over there. What do they think is going to happen, these cops? Do they think these school-aged children and these grandmas are going to storm the building? I mean, it's a political expression of policing itself. One of the things that's driven me crazy about Lethbridge, and that's why I love Lethbridge, it's that small town values, and they're nice to the cops here. And I don't propose that anyone be mean to someone else with no reason, but the embrace that the Coutts protesters and the Lethbridge community has had for police who came to bury them, it is, all I can say is I presume it's the Christian idea of turn the other cheek. These police, not necessarily these individual officers, but the Trudeau's RCMP was given a mandate: crush the political protesters who are embarrassing Trudeau. That's what caused the invocation of the Emergencies Act. There was no crime emergency. There was no public safety emergency. There was no war. There was no insurrection. There was only a political emergency. And shame on the RCMP and any other cop who participated in a show prosecution, and God forbid what becomes a show trial. I hope that the jury will put this prosecution in its place the same way a federal court judge Mosley did when he ruled that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was illegal and unconstitutional. So let me close with my remarks now. I will come back and have more to say. It's exciting to be here after 2 years of waiting. It's a delight to see the community out in force. Rebel News is not only going to be covering this story daily. My colleague Robert Krajcik, who's done a great job covering Tamara Leach's trial, he has moved to Lethbridge for the duration of this trial. By the way, if you want to help chip in to his modest economy class expenses, you can do that on a website we set up called truckertrials.com. I don't know, I'm excited that we're finally going to have our moment of justice. And I'm sure the 3 men who have had the stigma of these charges against them for years are looking forward to this process getting underway. That's it for now. I'm going to go into the courtroom where I will be live tweeting the proceedings today, sitting next to my colleague Robert Krajcik, and he will be here for the duration. I'll come back to Lethbridge when I can make the time, but you're in good hands with Robert. That's my morning report. I'll have more to say later.